low hum of the air conditioning. All eyes were locked on one woman, Pam Bondi. Dressed in a sharp navy blazer, her expression unreadable, she stood facing a federal judge who was seconds away from slapping her with a $50,000 fine. His voice was stern, his tone condescending, as if this ruling would be the end of the road for her. But what happened next flipped the entire room on its head. In just a matter of seconds, Bondi went from being cornered to taking complete control. It had started weeks earlier, with a legal standoff that many in the media were quick to dismiss as another political chess match. But for Pam Bondi, this wasn't just about politics. It was personal. She had spent years building a reputation as a tough, no-nonsense attorney who didn't back down, even when the odds were stacked against her. And now, her credibility and her career were both being dragged through the mud by a system she believed was being weaponized against her. The fine was just the tip of the iceberg, an attempt, in her eyes, to muzzle her voice at a critical moment. Behind closed doors, there had been heated debates. Bondi had been outspoken about a high-profile case involving political misconduct, and some powerful figures weren't happy. She'd exposed a network of connections that stretched into the upper echelons of influence, names people only whispered about behind closed doors. Then came the legal backlash, a surprise court order, a gag imposed without warning, and then, almost immediately, a threat of financial punishment if she spoke another word publicly. It felt less like justice and more like retaliation. The morning of the hearing, Bondi walked into the courthouse knowing what she was up against. Cameras swiveled, journalists whispered. Her legal team urged her to play it safe, to let the process unfold without confrontation. But Bondi wasn't one to be silenced. She believed the public had a right to know the truth, and if she had to stand alone in that courtroom, so be it. As the judge laid out the charges, speaking in a tone that suggested finality, Bondi listened silently until he reached the part about the $50,000 fine. That's when she moved. Calm, deliberate, but with fire in her eyes, she asked the court for a moment to speak. The judge, perhaps expecting a plea or an apology, nodded. What followed wasn't either. Bondi turned toward the gallery, not to the judge, and began to speak. Not about herself, but about the people whose lives had been impacted by the very misconduct she had exposed. She named no names. She didn't have to. Her words painted a vivid picture. Families devastated, careers ruined, trust broken. Her voice didn't tremble. Instead, it cut through the tension like a scalpel. She reminded the courtroom that the law was supposed to protect the truth, not punish those who reveal it. And then, with the entire room hanging on every word, she unveiled new information, documents that had not been seen before, evidence that changed the context of everything. The silence cracked into gasps. Even a judge leaned forward, clearly caught off guard. In that moment, the narrative shifted. She wasn't the one under scrutiny anymore. The system was. The tension reached a boiling point. For several minutes, the judge sat in stunned silence, flipping through the documents her team had submitted. The prosecutor at the other table looked visibly shaken. This wasn't part of the script. The fine that had been announced with such confidence now hung in the air like a bad idea no one wanted to claim. Finally, the judge cleared his throat and said he would need time to review the new material before proceeding further. The fine? No longer immediate. No longer certain. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. News spread fast, and when Bondi stepped out onto the steps, flashes exploded. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply said, "When you tell the truth, the cost should never be silence." That quote would make headlines the next morning. Commentators on both sides of the aisle began debating whether the judge had overreached, and suddenly the focus wasn't on Bondi's supposed violation, but on why she was being punished in the first place. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. People who had once been silent began to speak up. Other attorneys, journalists, even insiders came forward with their own accounts, adding weight to the very claims Bondi had fought to make public. The fine that was meant to silence her became the spark that ignited a larger investigation. The judge, once thought to be untouchable, found himself at the center of a judicial review. Pam Bondi didn't just walk away from that courtroom vindicated. She walked away having flipped the power dynamic entirely. And she did it not with anger, but with facts, with conviction, with a quiet, strategic brilliance that forced even her harshest critics to pause. Looking back, what happened in those few seconds after the judge tried to find her wasn't just a reversal of fate. It was a masterclass in courage under fire. Bondi reminded everyone watching that real strength isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about knowing when to speak and daring to say what needs to be said, even when every force around you is trying to shut you down. And in that courtroom, in those few unforgettable seconds, she didn't just turn the tables. She rewrote the rules. Pam Bondi wasn't new to pressure. She'd faced firestorms before, media scrutiny, political crossfire, legal deadlocks. But this was different. In the quiet moments before stepping into that courtroom, she wasn't just an attorney or a former prosecutor. She was a woman standing at the edge of a cliff, feeling the weight of a system that was trying to push her over. Her motivation was clear: protect the truth, even if it meant putting her career on the line. But beneath the polished exterior, there was a flicker of fatigue, exhaustion from fighting the same battles again and again, and the growing fear that this time, the machine might win. Across the room, Judge Callahan sat high above the courtroom, not with cruelty, but with a kind of rigid certainty. He wasn't a villain, not in the traditional sense. He believed in law and order, believed in the sanctity of court procedures. But lately, his rulings had reflected something else too, a creeping frustration with the chaos outside the courtroom, the media noise, the constant politicization of justice. To him, Bondi represented that chaos. Outspoken, defiant, loud in ways that judges are trained to fear. In his eyes, the fine wasn't personal. It was a means of restoring order. But in trying to impose silence, he underestimated the storm quietly brewing in her resolve. The courtroom itself seemed like neutral ground, but it wasn't. It was a stage set by power, shadowed by whispers of political favors and backdoor deals. The case that brought them all here had started innocently enough: an investigation, a leak, then a statement Bondi gave that rattled some very high places. She didn't name names, but the implications were enough. A warning was issued. She didn't flinch. Then came the order, the fine, the confrontation. What no one knew, not even Bondi's closest aides, was that she hadn't come empty-handed. Days before the hearing, she'd received a folder. Anonymous, untraceable, but inside, the missing piece, a document that tied everything together. She didn't know who sent it. She only knew one thing. The moment would come when she'd have to use it. The moment Bondi revealed the documents, everything shifted. The courtroom buzzed with confusion, and within minutes, the outside world erupted. News alerts lit up phones across the country. Asterisk Pam Bondi drops bombshell evidence in courtroom showdown. Asterisk social media exploded. Some called her a hero, a whistleblower standing tall against a rigged system. Others accused her of grandstanding, claiming she was playing politics with legal processes. Hashtags like hashtag Bondi Unbroken and hashtag Justice on Trial started trending, each tweet and post feeding the frenzy. Back in the courthouse, Judge Callahan's confidence faltered. He kept his face still, but his grip on the bench tightened as he scanned the pages she'd submitted. He'd been blindsided, and he knew it. Alone in his chambers later that evening, the weight of his decision pressed hard. He wasn't just facing a question of legal protocol anymore. He was facing the court of public opinion, and maybe even a deeper investigation into his own impartiality. For a man who had built a career on precision and control, the uncertainty was unbearable. Bondi, meanwhile, wasn't celebrating. Her team was buzzing with cautious optimism, but she sat quietly in the corner of the room, watching the coverage roll in. She wasn't naive. She knew that turning the tide in a courtroom didn't mean the battle was over. In fact, it might have just begun. Allies who'd once kept their distance started reaching out, and strangers were sending messages of support. Yet even amid the noise, she remained grounded. The spotlight brought attention, yes, but also danger. If this case unraveled the way she suspected it might, more powerful people would have reason to panic. Still, in that chaos, there were moments of clarity. A message from an old colleague, thanking her for saying what others were too afraid to. A brief glance at the courtroom security guard, who gave her a subtle nod of respect. Tiny things, but they reminded her why she fought. The truth didn't roar, it whispered. And right now, it was whispering louder than it had in years. That night, long after the courtroom had emptied and the headlines had reached every corner of the country, Pam Bondi sat alone in her office, staring out the window as the city lights flickered in silence. The adrenaline had worn off, replaced by a calm, focused determination. She replayed every word from the hearing, every reaction, and for the first time in weeks, she wasn't just reacting, she was planning. This wasn't just about defending herself anymore. It was about exposing the broader rot, the quiet manipulations behind closed doors, the pattern of silencing anyone who dared to ask the wrong questions. Instead of waiting for the system to act, she made a decision. She'd take her findings beyond the courtroom, not to the press, not to a camera, but to the people who still had the power to investigate without fear. She contacted a bipartisan oversight committee, one she trusted, and requested a private session. She wasn't interested in spectacle. She wanted results. Quietly, she began assembling a dossier. Not just the anonymous documents, but records, testimonies, timelines. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer and more damning. Meanwhile, Judge Callahan sat in his chambers, the buzz of the day refusing to fade. He stared at the evening news in disbelief, watching clips of Bondi's testimony played on repeat. Doubt crept in, curling like smoke through his thoughts. Had he been too quick? Had he allowed frustration to cloud his judgment? For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, regret. Not because he'd lost control, but because maybe, just maybe, he'd become part of the problem he'd sworn to guard against. Back in her office, Bondi closed the thick binder she'd been compiling and exhaled. This wasn't a case anymore, it was a movement. And though the cost was still unknown, the path forward was finally clear. She wouldn't wait for permission to act. She'd already started. 2 weeks later, the air inside the Capitol hearing room was thick with tension. Cameras were banned, but reporters filled every available seat. Pam Bondi entered quietly, the thick binder of evidence clutched in her hands. This wasn't a trial. This was a private oversight session, but its weight felt heavier than any courtroom appearance. Across from her sat the committee, their faces stern but attentive. This was her moment, not to defend herself, but to expose the truth she had unearthed. As she began to speak, there was no anger in her voice, just calm, unshakable resolve. She laid out the timeline, the threats, the sudden gag order, and the evidence she believed proved manipulation at the highest levels. Page by page, testimony by testimony, she brought to light what many suspected but few had dared to say. There were no dramatics, no grandstanding, just facts. And as she finished, there was a silence more profound than applause. Word of the closed-door testimony leaked within hours. Whispers turned into roars. Investigations were opened. The fine against her? Dropped. The judge? Recused. But what truly marked the climax was a letter she received shortly after. Anonymous, just like the folder that started it all. For simple words, asterisk, you were right. Thank you. Asterisk, it was unsigned, but something about it struck her deeply. Whether it came from insider, a whistleblower, or even the judge himself, she didn't know. But it meant something, a quiet acknowledgement in a world that rarely admits mistakes. In the weeks that followed, she returned to a quieter life. The headlines moved on, but the change she sparked remained. New protocols were introduced to protect whistleblowers. Oversight was strengthened. And in one symbolic gesture, the courthouse where she had once stood facing a $50,000 fine now bore a small plaque near the entrance. Asterisk, truth is the foundation of justice. Asterisk, Pam Bondi didn't walk away with vengeance. She walked away with something far more powerful: vindication, clarity, and the knowledge that one voice, steady and unwilling to yield, could still shake the pillars of power. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a courtroom clash or a legal loophole. It was a story about courage, about what it means to stand alone in the storm and still speak the truth, even when it costs you everything. Pam Bondi didn't win because she outmaneuvered the system. She won because she refused to let fear dictate her silence. She stood not only for herself, but for everyone who'd ever been told to keep quiet, to play along, to sit down when their voice was needed most. Through every tense moment, every stare across the courtroom, every whisper of doubt in her own heart, she chose conviction. And so did others. The clerk who slipped her the nod of approval. The anonymous source who trusted her with the truth. Even the judge, who in his own quiet way began to question the rigidity of a system that had lost its soul. It wasn't just one woman's journey. It was a ripple effect, a reminder that the fight for integrity is never really over, and it's always worth it. The room where it all began now echoes with a different kind of silence. Not the hush of intimidation, but the calm of resolved tension, of justice served in full. And as Bondi walked those familiar courthouse steps for the last time, the wind carried a quiet peace. Her fight was over, but the message she left behind lingered. Truth doesn't need volume. It needs courage. And sometimes, one voice, steady, unwavering, is all it takes to change everything.